Hello, BookTube and all Repairman Jack fans. My name is Nathan. Thank you so much for watching. This is my longer discussion video for Bloodline, which is book number 11 in the Repairman Jack series. Bloodline was first published in 2007. So this is following Harbingers, which is book number 10, and the one that comes after this is By the Sword. So I'm going to give a brief plot summary, and then I'm going to get into some comments and points of discussion. So Bloodline is, first of all, it's fantastic. It's a really, really fun book in the series. It's actually, when I'm rereading it, I'm really considering this, and I'm thinking this has got to be one of my favorites. It's right up there. There's a few that really stand out for me, but namely, I would say Conspiracies and Gateways. I really like those two, and Bloodline, I think, works really well also. So it's a pretty straightforward Repairman Jack book. Harbingers is a little bit different. There's twists and turns in Harbingers, but with this one, it's more of a traditional Repairman Jack book, but there's also a few turns that you get in the series. So basically, Jack is approached by this woman, Christy Pickering, who has hired a private detective to investigate what's going on between her 18-year-old daughter and this man that her daughter is now dating, who is twice her age. He's 36. He says that his name is Jerry Bethlehem, and she is very concerned about this. Now her daughter is, living with the guy, and she's very concerned about this. So she hires a detective, but the detective basically just stops communicating with her. She hires Jack to figure out what's happened. Jack starts investigating, and as part of this, he's a little reluctant to get involved because if you remember from Harbingers, Gia and Vicky, they got into an accident from the emissary where Miller, drove the panel truck into them. So they're still recovering from the accident, and he really doesn't want to be doing Repairman Jack stuff, but he reluctantly agrees to help. So he investigates, he finds the detective has been killed. And, in this kind of sadistic way where he's bungee corded inside, face down in his bathtub, where you kind of get his head up enough and he's handcuffed and all of that, but the water's just running constantly. So essentially he would just collapse from exhaustion and ultimately drown, but it would take a while. So it's quite a sadistic death. So Jack finds the detective dead and then investigates his computer and comes up with a bunch of different things. And I read that section multiple times because I'm going, how did Jack actually get into all of these other storylines? Because he starts learning about the Creighton Institute, and then this Dr. Levy, and a couple other things. So I'm like, just north of the city in Rathburn, New York, all of this stuff. Basically, he just looks on the detective's computer, sees a bunch of these things, and then goes there. So he goes to the Creighton Institute, he starts investigating, and ultimately, as the story plays out, you realize what's going on. So I'm going to simplify it a fair bit, but Christy Pickering, her and the guy that's now dating her daughter are half siblings. They have the same father, Jonah Stevens. And I do have a question for fans of the Adversary Cycle, because I have not read all the books in the Adversary Cycle. Does Jonah Stevens show up in there? I will ultimately get to them. I've got them all on my shelf over here. I haven't read those ones yet. So anyway, Jonah Stevens, he has fathered Christy Pickering, and also Jeremy Bolton, or Jerry Bethlehem, because he's got this alias. And then there's also another half-sibling, Hank Thompson, who is the leader of the Kickers, right? This new sort of cult, kind of taking off from the Dormentalists, but more of a self-help guru, new age kind of cult, not so much the version of Scientology that you get with the Dormentalists. Anyway, Hank Thompson, Jeremy Bethlehem, and Jeremy Bolton, and then Christy Pickering, all fathered by Jonah Stevens. The reason why this has happened, and this connects into the Creighton Institute, is that Jonah Stevens essentially has got really, really high levels of ODNA, or other DNA, otherness DNA, right? This very dark, violent dark violent impulses that you have and the trigger to set off those impulses and all of this stuff. And he's effectively trying to concentrate all of this family genetic material to create essentially a super baby who's going to be so full of this ODNA that it will bring about the otherness on Earth. Now, because I don't know enough about Jonas Stevens, I don't know how much he really understood about this, but he's certainly been working on behalf of the otherness, whether he knows it or not. Right? And that's where you get into the kicker man, which is that weird little symbol, the idea of the kicker man, like holding the baby and protecting it. And so ultimately, this guy, Jeremy Bolton slash Jerry Bethlehem, he is with Christy's daughter, Dawn, who is, as it turns out, his daughter. And it's so I've tried to like track it through, but it gets so creepy and confusing that it's kind of hard to even know how to refer to them in terms of the family tree, because he's like, well, he's her half uncle but also father, now boyfriend. Ugh. So anyway, he ends up orchestrating all of this to impregnate Dawn. And the reason why he is Dawn's father is because he kidnapped Christy Pickering. He disguised himself the entire time like he wore a mask, and then he sexually assaulted her until he ensured that she was pregnant. And this is all from his father, Jonas Stevens, who had this plan to concentrate this genetic material. And so basically the half-siblings who then have a child, which is Dawn, and then he then ends up getting into a relationship with Dawn to then get her pregnant, so she's now pregnant. And at the end of the book, she is still pregnant, and that's one of the things that I really like about what happens in Bloodline and moving forward, is you get Dawn and this baby and all of that just carries over into the next book. We haven't really seen that so far in the series. And I said in the short spoiler-free review video that you could probably read the books in the series out of order for the most part up until this point. But I would say kind of from Bloodline going forward, you really shouldn't read them out of order, in part because of this, because you now have got Dawn Pickering and the baby, and we're just getting closer and closer to Night World, and we know that's where it's all going to end. So you kind of it's a bit of a turn in the series for that reason. So you have all of that. So you've got the doctors from the Creighton Institute who have been investigating this. They've figured out what ODNA is, and they're trying to get these criminals to study them scientifically to figure out why some people have elevated levels of this. What is it? And they're just investigating all of this. So that's basically everything that happens in the book. And, ultimately by the end of it, Hank Thompson, so Jeremy Bolton's half-brother, he's still alive. He's still leading the Kickers. That's going to move into the next book as well. But Jeremy Bolton, he dies by the end of this. Dr. Vecca at the Creighton Institute, she dies. Christy Pickering, she dies as well. So you get a fair number of characters who die, but the ones who don't factor into the books going forward. Like I say, that's a bit of a turn. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through my notes from the book. Some of them I've got, more to say than others. So I thought that it was interesting. If you look at the very beginning of this book, then you have Jack having the nightmare that he's behind the wheel of the truck that hits Vicky and Gia. And he wakes up from this and he's been having this recurring nightmare, and he knows that means that the watcher, the observer, the man in the overcoat and the Homburg hat is watching him. And this is, of course, Glycan. As we read through the series, I feel like that's, whether you think it's a spoiler or not, the full discussion videos, I just spoil stuff. So it's Glycan who's watching him, but it's a framing device that Wilson is using here, because that's how the book starts. And if you look at the very, very end of it, then the Glycan is watching Jack again. So it's, like I say, it's a framing device, right? The beginning and end, Glycan's there, and we don't really see him anywhere in the middle. This is also something that's significant, that as we're getting closer to Night World, we're seeing Glycan factor in a little bit more, even though he's not doing anything, but just he's there, he's watching, he's paying attention to Jack. Okay, so that's a note about that. Now, there's lots of metafiction in this book, which is so much fun. I love metafiction, especially the way Wilson is doing it. Like, I couldn't love it more. If you're unfamiliar with the term, then metafiction just means fiction that's aware of itself. And, you know, in cinematic terms, it would be like breaking the fourth wall, right? Sort of speaking directly to the audience. That's not what he's doing here, but there is a little bit of the books, the playfulness between our world and the world of Repairman Jack, that there's not so much a distinction between fiction and non-fiction. And so this starts in the second chapter, where Jack wants to set up a website, and then he finds that all of these website names, like the domain names for, you know, Repairman Jack, Repairman-Jack, Repairman_Jack, were already taken. And then he says, what the hell? He finally had to settle for myspace.com/fixits. And so it's just one of those things. I'm like, when I was rereading this, I was going, is Wilson doing this because those domain names were actually taken when he was trying to come up with something for these books at that point, and then he just worked it into the story? I just thought it was funny. But basically what he's doing, and you're going to see it comes up a few times in this book, is that effectively Repairman Jack is real. He's in our world, and we're somehow reading books about him, right? You'll see how it works out, how he continues to play with that. All right, on page 20 of my edition, then there's this mention of a guy from Jack's hometown who has passed away in the Monroe Hospital, and Abe has found this in the newspaper, and then he talks about it. He says that his name is Crazy Walt, and it talks about Jack, you know, having this connection to him. He says he had fond memories of Crazy Walt and unaccountably warm feelings for him. A vague recollection of Walt saving his life as a kid. Or maybe not. Kind of a blur. So many things from back then were blurred. Rest in peace, Walt. You sure didn't have much when you were alive. So my question is, because I've only read one of the young adult Repairman Jack books, and the one that I read it only once when it first came out, so I can't remember. Is Crazy Walt a character in there? I probably won't even think about this when I'm reading them, but if anybody remembers, please comment, because I'm curious about that. Okay, continuing on with the metafiction, in my edition, pages 72 and then moving into page 75, then Jack, he goes to a bookstore to try to find Kick by Hank Thompson, right? The Kicker Revolution, this sort of self-help book that everybody seems to be reading that's really taken off. So he wants to get a map, first of all, so that way he can get up to the Creighton Institute. But he also finds Kick, so he's interested in that. And then he finds these books by this author named, I want to get this right, P. Frank Winslow. P. Frank Winslow. Okay, so it's very, very obvious that this is playing on F. Paul Wilson. And the book that he sees is Rakshasa, right? And it sure looks like a Rakoshi monster on the front. And I'm just skipping over to the next section. And, you know, he finds that there's a whole series of them. These Jake Fix novels, right? Instead of Repairman Jack, it's Jake Fix with 2 X's, of course. And this is the bottom of page 74. It says, he wanted to hole up in his apartment and read the novels, but hadn't had time, not with this Rathburg jaunt looming. He got a look at the back covers, however, where he learned that the hero, Jake Fix, was an ex-Navy SEAL and former CIA Black Ops expert. Usually these characters are one or the other, but this guy was both. He'd been betrayed by his superiors, weren't they all, and had gone underground. He now lived in secret, helping those who couldn't help themselves. A rogue Robin Hood, sticking it to man at every chance. Hoo boy, cliche piled on cliche. Many times Jack wished he'd had SEAL training or its equivalent to learn about weapons and ammo and demolition in an organized setting instead of piecemeal on and off the street. Wouldn't that have been a treat? And having an FBI or CIA connection would have been beyond cool. Want to know about this Jerry Bethlehem? All he'd have to do was get a fingerprint and have his contact run it through the databases. Probably wind up with a whole file on him. But not for Jack. He had to do it the old-fashioned, low-tech, damn near no-tech way. And then it continues on about how, Jack kind of cringing at these books, going, ugh, like as if, but at the same time going, how does this guy know what's happening? And I feel like there's a whole bunch of commentary here in terms of Wilson's, because it's playfulness, right? Because he's basically in some ways inserting himself into the story, but not, because Jack then interviews this guy, and as part of it, he asks him how he came up with the idea for Rakshasa, right, or the Rakoshi monster, and the author Winslow says, Rakshasa started off with a real nightmare. I was trapped on a rooftop where I was being chased by a monster or demon of some sort. I can't remember a thing about how it looked, just that it was after me, and no matter what I shot at it, threw at it, cut it with, the thing kept coming. Jack felt a chill. Winslow had just described what had gone through on the roof of his own building nearly 2 years ago. And the guy had the dream basically at the exact same time that Jack was dealing with the Rakoshi monster in the tomb. Though the crazy thing is that I've heard Wilson talk about how he came up with the tomb and Repairman Jack. And that's essentially exactly it. That's exactly how I've heard him describe it. So in some ways, he's inserting himself into the story and then saying, hey guys, I know we love Repairman Jack and as a fictional character, but he's real, which is so much fun. I love that trope. But at the same time, Winslow is definitely not Wilson, because he's changing the story and he's embellishing, talks about the books being far more melodramatic than what really happened. And, that his editor, I think he blames his editor for this, but basically saying, I can't remember if it's his editor or his agent, but saying that, they didn't want that. Some of the books that he had, like conspiracies, they weren't interested in that. And the other one, like Hosts, I think it's Hosts that he talks about, where it's it's too sci-fi, and they weren't interested in that. And then embellishing, giving Jake Fix, this CIA and Black Ops background and all this stuff. And Jack kind of going I wish it was like that, but it's really not. I feel like it's also a commentary on publishing and what publishing wants, and Wilson kind of going, yeah, but what publishing wants, and specifically it is editors, but really it's pushed by marketing. He's going, it's stupid, it's terrible, they just make bad books, but they're simplified, they're easy to read, and if you just make the character, even if it's unrealistic, just super capable with all of these talents and skills, then they can do spectacular things. But Repairman Jack is really supposed to be grounded in reality, and he takes a lot of care, Wilson does, when he's describing what Jack does, to make it very clear that this is not superhero fiction, right? These are crime thrillers, and it's very much grounded in reality, that Jack has to figure out how to solve these things without high-tech gadgets and things like that. And I feel like that's kind of what Wilson is doing. He's going, this is sort of what publishing wants, but I'm not doing it, right? I won't give in, and I'm making Jack kind of an ordinary, everyday person. I want to keep thinking about this, but that's really all that I've got so far. If I do get a chance to actually talk to F. Paul Wilson about this, and that's going to be one of my questions, is was this kind of a commentary on publishing and how they essentially want to appeal to the lowest common denominator, and they don't want you to say, well, the character's complex and he's not going to use a lot of gadgets and he doesn't have a lot of background and training in all of this, he has to learn it all himself, and it's not always convenient, and he does get frustrated at times because he's operating mostly independently and with these shady characters in the underworld, the criminal underworld of New York City. And it makes his job, being Repairman Jack, that much more difficult, because he can't just call in reinforcements. And I wonder if there's been some pushback that he experienced, or at the very least, if he kind of looked at, let's just say, for instance, like Jack Reacher books, to say, well, like, it's easy if you just give your character this entire background and he's got all of these connections to people, that can in some ways make the narrative go a little bit better, or Jason Bourne or whatever else, right? Like, there's characters that he's kind of referring to sort of in a dismissive, I don't know, critical way, right? And obviously, if you like Repairman Jack books, you probably go with that to some degree. You're like, yeah, I prefer these books to that stuff, even if you read some of the other ones, and I do. But I definitely like the way Wilson grounds it in reality as much as he does. Okay, so this is a longer discussion. I just wanted to basically point to it that there's something significant going on here. This is when Jack is talking to Dr. Levy from the Creighton Institute and figuring out what's going on with ODNA. And essentially, Levy's research, the implications are that if you can show on a genetic level that somebody has got high levels of ODNA, then what does that do to the criminal justice system? Because if you then say, look, it's not my fault, it's my brain chemistry, and because I have specific genes that trigger these, that cause violent impulses and trigger these violent impulses, they can be overwhelming, and therefore I'm not responsible for my actions. And this is a very real discussion that's been going on. I mean, I've read a number of articles. I've taught this at the college level. Then, we were looking at this issue, and we read a number of articles about this and the idea of brain chemistry and what does that do to the criminal justice system. And can't you always kind of say that there's some factors influencing a criminal who does something? What happens with free will the more we learn about brain chemistry? And it's a big, complicated legal question, philosophical question. And so it kind of touches on this, and it seems like it's fairly obvious where Jack and Levy, and I think probably Wilson lands. I don't know about Wilson, but I kind of suspect, which is, even if we can find all of these triggers, you still have to believe in free will, that even if somebody is getting impulses, that does not force them to act on the impulse, and they can also avoid certain situations. People do still have free will, even if you can say all of these factors contributed to it, including genetics, including brain chemistry, but they're not causal, if that makes sense. I think that's where Wilson lines up on it, but it's a big question, and it's just interesting that it comes up in this book. It doesn't go too deeply into it aside from that conversation that they have, but it's definitely introduced. All right, another quick note that I have. So there's this reference. This is another, like, does this show up in the young adult books? On page 190 of my edition, then you have this little image. I'll try to show it for you here. You can see the image there of the Esserish seal of the Septimus Lodge. The Lodge, that's what they called this one in his hometown, a secret society that supposedly predated the Masons and made them seem like an open book. Jack had sneaked into the local outpost as a kid and had a vague recollection of being unsettled by what he'd seen. Nothing like the fanciful tales whispered in the kid's underground, but definitely strange. I feel like that came up in the first young adult Jack book, but honestly, like I say, it's been a while since I've read it, and I can't really remember much about it. So if somebody has a good recollection of that, can you let me know just in the comments? Does that actually show up in the YA books? Because that seems like an interesting thing, and I believe that's where the Kickers are now. They've settled into the Lodge, where, and as best I remember, they basically have formed a connection. some kind of deal with the Lodge and the Kicker movement that they'll share facilities and resources. But that's basically as best I remember it. All right. So an interesting thing that you have here is the way and I'm thinking about Harbingers, right? So thinking about Harbingers and the way that losing the unborn baby, Jack and Gia, losing Emma, the way that pairs with the fact that the otherness is now, in the very next book in Bloodline, trying to bring an otherness baby into the world. So we find out that it's the ally that does not want the heir, who could then become the Sentinel, which is Jack, does not want Jack to have a baby. But the otherness absolutely wants there to be a baby loaded with this otherness DNA. And I feel like it's essentially, it kind of goes back to a lot of biblical themes in terms of, if you know much about this, in terms of theology, specifically Christian theology, and the way that Satan, and I'm thinking specifically about Milton and Paradise Lost, the way, because Milton just does such a good job of showing how Satan is constantly taking what God created and intended for good and then inverting it, twisting it, turning it into a perversion of what God intended, but similar, right? And so, like in Paradise Lost, and Satan has kind of got his own evil trinity to be paired, but an inverse version of it to be paired with the Holy Trinity on God's side. And I feel like there's something going on here with this, that the otherness is trying to bring this baby into the world, while the ally is trying to, does eliminate the Jack's unborn baby, right? And it's interesting how you get that from Harbingers, and now you have this very significant pregnant woman for the otherness that Rosalem is quite interested in protecting the baby and everything leading up to Night World with it. So I feel like there's some kind of connection there. All right. This was just a really, if I had not read these books so close together, I would not have caught this. And it's honestly, it's not a big deal. It was just one of those things like, oh, that's funny. That Jack is working with Russ Tweet. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Tuit, right? Tuit. I can't remember. I know that Wilson at one point said how to pronounce his name, but I think it's Tweet is how it's supposed to be pronounced. But he goes and he gets Russell's help, who is, in case you forgot, then Russell is the computer hacker that Jack uses whenever he needs essentially tech support. Whenever he needs computer help, then he goes to Russ, who is completely willing to do anything illegal to do with computers and the internet and all of that. So in Harbingers, the little introduction to Russ, the little reminder to the reader, because he doesn't show up for the first time in Harbingers, but Wilson always ensures that he reminds readers this is who the character is. We've seen them before. In Harbingers, he has a 25-year ban from the internet, and then in Bloodline, it's a 10-year ban. So it's obviously, it's a little bit of a continuity error. I honestly, it doesn't make any difference. I know some people will go, we caught you. I don't think it's a bad thing. It's one of those things that, as part of this project, I kind of wanted to know what would happen if I do read the books in quick order. And even though I had this big gap in the middle, getting back into reading them in quick succession, I want to know what I catch that I wouldn't necessarily catch if I took my time, if I read one and then 6 months later I read another one and 6 months later I read another one. But because I finished Harbingers and then finished Bloodline, 2 days later, then I caught it. So anyway, it was just a funny little thing that I noticed. All right. So Jack, at the end of the book, and this is really, I think, the theme of Bloodline, at least one of the significant themes that Wilson is exploring. He kills Jeremy Bolton, or Jerry Bethlehem, and what he does is he basically so Jerry went to Rathburn, New York. He kills Dr. Vecca, right, who is part of the Creighton Institute, doing all these experiments on, people with high O DNA. And then he's on his way to then go and kill Dr. Levy. Jack ends up stopping him before he gets there, beats him up, and does quite a good job of it, puts him in his trunk. And then Jack knows at this point that he's already, this Jerry guy has killed Jack's customer, Christy. So essentially, Jack is now operating without a customer. He knows that this guy has done awful things, he did awful things, of course, to Christy, kidnapping her and all that, impregnating her against her will, being a half-brother, and then getting her daughter to fall in love with him, and then impregnating, his daughter as well. Ugh, it's so messed up. And that's a whole other thing, but this is not the first time that it shows up in the books. But otherness and sexual depravity and incest and sexual assault, those are all to do with the otherness, and Wilson uses that. He absolutely uses that, because I'm trying to think of what book it is. I want to say that it's in Legacies that we saw that before. We saw instances of incest, that it's something that Wilson does, and we've also seen that before with what is it? Crisscross with the Dormentalist Church with Luther Brady, which I want to bring up, with pedophilia and just all of that sexual perversion. It's always Wilson he's explicitly linking it to the otherness, that Rosalind enjoys that in the otherness. That's the kind of thing that you would expect. The ally might be neutral, but that's not associated with the ally. Right. So anyway, Jerry's done all of these awful things. Jack beats him up, puts him in his trunk, goes to a rest stop, finds a couple trucks. One of them is idling, so the truck driver is obviously inside. He's going to be back momentarily. Jack crawls underneath the truck with Jerry, and then he's got them all taped up and all of that. And then he basically tapes him, or I'm sure it's not tape, but he ends up using handcuffs or rope or something, but he ties him to the truck, and so that way, and Jerry is still alive, but that way he'll just get dragged for a while, and even after he's dead, he's still going to be dragged. It's a brutal death. I'm not defending Jerry in any way, or the fact that he should have lived or anything like that. I'm not doing any of that, but I want to read this section. So Jack, in part, I guess, to verify that Jerry is dead, does this, but Jack, he got back in and followed. The rig had barely made it to the entrance ramp when Jack's headlights picked up a gleaming line of red winding from beneath the trailer. A line of blood, a bloodline, which is a really lovely little tie into the title of the book. Jack stared at the red streak. There goes your bloodline. But this was not the end of Bolton's bloodline or Jonah Stevens. It lived on in Thompson and in Dawn, especially in her baby. And then it goes on. But it's not only a brutal death, and Jack does it in part so that way, because he's kind of got this goal that the authorities will continue believing that Jerry Bethlehem, or Jeremy Bolton, right, the alias, that they'll just think that he's on the run, and they'll continue looking for him, but they won't know that he's dead. So that way nobody will try to figure out who killed him, and that could lead back to Jack, and with him working as a private investigator for Christy Pickering and all of this stuff. Sure. Okay, so there's all of that he figures if the body gets dragged long enough, then there won't be very much left at all to identify it, right? Fingerprints and dental records and all that stuff. It's going to just be such a mess that there really won't be much. They might be able to use his DNA, which is ultimately what they do. But that's the Creighton Institute that does that. So yeah, he could do that, but there's a lot of other ways that he could have done this, right? he had him in his trunk. He could have taken him anywhere and then dumped the body somewhere where nobody would find it for a very long time. He could have done other things to try to mask Jerry's identity to make him harder to identify. But he intentionally does something that you could say is pretty sadistic, right? That we've seen Jerry be pretty sadistic. And then you find out at the end of this, because Jack ends up getting tested by Dr. Levy, that Jack has got ridiculously high levels of ODNA, probably just as much as Jerry and Hank Thompson, if not more. And it seems quite certain that Jack has got the trigger mechanism as well, the trigger gene. So then he and Levy are kind of considering this, and Jack is considering what's the difference between him and Jeremy Bethlehem. If he's got really elevated levels of otherness DNA, and if he has this incredible, capacity for violence, and at times fairly sadistic violence, at least in this instance, then what does that mean for him? And on the one hand, I think, well, how much of this is like otherness DNA? Because that's just what the Creighton Institute with Dr. Vecca and Dr. Levy, what they call it. How much of it is otherness DNA, or isn't necessarily connected specifically to the otherness? Because we've seen that the ally can be incredibly ruthless, the way it, a spear has no branches, and it's perfectly willing to kill Gia and her unborn baby and Vicky and all of this, willing to kill all the people at the airport in order to take out Jack's father, right? We've seen that the ally can be pretty brutal and vicious and violent as well. So that's why I'm going, is it really otherness DNA, or is it just that because Jack is the heir, potentially becoming the Sentinel, he has to have this capacity in him, and that's why he's a good candidate to be the heir and potentially the Sentinel? Or is this that Jack really does have bad stuff in him that really is entirely otherness, that is not associated with just everything to do with the cosmic war? I think it's an interesting question. But what I mean by the theme is that Jack is much more willing in this book, and also in Harbingers, to engage in violence, and specifically murder, in cases where before I don't think he would have. I don't think, and I talked about it last week with Harbingers, I don't think that he would have necessarily killed, maybe he would have killed Miller with the Janissary, but the three other guys, I don't see why he would have killed them. You can go and watch that video if you're curious about that. But my point is, wow, like after Gia, Vicky, and Emma get hit by the truck, it seems like something has turned in Jack. In Harbingers, he is resorting to murder in a place where it is effective, but I feel like what we've seen before in the books, Jack wouldn't necessarily turn to that so quickly. And in Bloodline, there's multiple instances where he considers it just as a solution, and then at the end he could have done anything with Jerry, but he doesn't. And the way that, I think, because I was trying to think of how this connects with other books and what I mean by this, and I was trying to think about that with Harbingers, but with Crisscross, right? So I'm pointing at Crisscross on the shelf here, but with Crisscross, I was trying to remind myself of what happened there. So you have the Dormentalist Church and Luther Brady, and I wanted to verify that Luther Brady, who is planting all of these pillars and putting human beings in there at various nexus points across Earth, essentially to bring about Night World. So he's definitely a murderer. We know that he is a child sex offender, right? That he's a pedophile. He's done all kinds of awful stuff, and Jack does not kill him. Right? Jack orchestrates an incredibly elaborate plan, and I feel like in part there's moments earlier in the series where you look at this and you go, This would just be so much simpler if Jack just killed the person, but he doesn't. He has to have his repair, his fix, his solution that's elegant, and there's no connection to him. There's no evidence that he was ever involved. It looks like a person. Everything went sideways because they had orchestrated their own demise by making bad decisions all along the way, and they would not actually know that it was somebody behind the scenes carefully orchestrating all of this to bring about their demise. That's what we've seen for the most part until you get into Harbingers, and as best I remember, we see this really a much darker, more violent version of Jack. That darkness has always been there, right? You always get that flash when something goes wrong, and Jack has got that darkness in him that he can go there, but he usually resists it. But we don't see this so much anymore, at least in these two books, and as best I remember, not so much going forward. And I feel like that's got to have to do with the fact that now that the more family members he loses, right, where he, even especially in Harbingers, because he finds out, even going back to his mother, that his mother died because he's the heir. That was a twist, like in the series, and one that I had actually forgotten. So the ally was behind his mother's death, and then his sister Kate, and his father, and then his brother Tom, and then almost took out Gia, Vicky, and did take his unborn daughter of Emma. I feel like at this point, Jack is just like, whatever's going on, whatever I've been pulled into with this cosmic shadow war between the ally and the otherness, he's not going to stop these violent impulses that he has anymore. But it's just interesting because Jack earlier in the series was so reluctant to kill people that he would avoid it essentially at all costs. And in some ways he would do something where the person would suffer so much more, suffer not just a violent death, but suffer long-term consequences of it, where the suffering just endures, like with Luther Brady, right? That everything for that man, like the entire life that he had built, is just destroyed. But with this, there's no attempt by Jack to try to come up with some kind of elegant solution to Jerry Bethlehem. There's not an attempt. It's just, now I'll kill him, and I'm going to kill him in a really brutal, violent way, and he does, and that's it. And then he does consider, whoa, is that the DNA in me? Is that, what's the difference between me and this guy? And obviously we know there's a big difference. I don't think that's really a particularly difficult question to answer, right? That obviously Jack is good and Jerry Bethlehem is awful. But that capacity for violence, again, like I say, I feel like this has to do with, is that really that capacity for violence? Is that otherness, or is that just the cosmic war that's going on, and as part of being the heir, potentially taking over for Glycan as the sentinel, that just he has to have that capacity for violence, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we definitely see it amping up, right? That we're seeing more instances of Jack doing this. He thinks about it more quickly. He seems more willing to do these violent things. And so, yeah, that's just basically, those are my thoughts as I've gone through Bloodline. I gotta say, I really, really, really enjoyed reading Bloodline. I can't remember if this is my second or third time. I feel like it's my third time reading it. Some of them I've read twice before, some of them I've read 3 times. Like, I'm reading for the third time. But boy, this one is really good. It's a really fun read. If you have not read Bloodline in a while, then treat yourself to it, because it's so much fun, especially if you like that kind of stuff that I just talked about. But I think if you read Repairman Jack, then yes, that's exactly what you enjoy about the series. But to see this turn in Jack, and I guess that's what I mean by that, is I feel like more so than Harbingers, Bloodline is kind of like Now we're moving on to everything to do, like everything leading up to Night World, and we have a very different Jack at this point, because now that he knows everything and his role that we've learned in Harbingers, we're not getting the same old Jack anymore. So anyway, those are my thoughts on Bloodline. Any of the questions that I've asked, please feel free to answer them below, or any comments or thoughts that you have, and feel free to like and share, subscribe to the channel, all of that stuff. All right, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.